There's a moment, and I think most of us have felt it, when a story reaches through the page or the screen and does something almost impossible. It changes you. Not in a loud, dramatic way, but quietly, deeply. Like something that was sleeping inside you has just opened its eyes. Maybe it was the moment Frodo offered the ring of power to Galadriel and she refused it. Maybe it was when the alien ship in Arrival didn't come to conquer, but to give. Maybe it was a single line from Yoda, or a scene from Avatar: The Last Airbender, or a chapter of C.S. Lewis that made you put the book down and just sit with it. Here's what I want to explore with you today. What if those moments weren't accidents? What if fantasy and science fiction, the genre we so often dismiss as escapism, are actually one of humanity's most powerful vehicles for spiritual wisdom? Today, we're doing something a little different. We're not going to be talking about a meditation technique or a quote from the Buddha or a specific wisdom tradition, at least not directly. Instead, we're going to go to the elves, the Jedi, the time travelers, and the androids. Because I genuinely believe, I hope to show you by the end of this video, that the greatest works of fantasy and science fiction are not just entertainment. They are spiritual texts dressed in extraordinary clothes. They carry wisdom about power and its corruption, about empathy for the deeply other, about death, impermanence, the nature of reality itself, and above all, about what it means to be a conscious being trying to live well in a universe that is far stranger and more beautiful than we usually allow ourselves to notice. So let's dive in. This is the spiritual heart of fantasy and science fiction. Let me start with a question. Why do human beings tell stories at all? Not just fantasy stories, any stories. Every culture in every era of recorded history has gathered around a fire, literal or metaphorical, and said, "Let me tell you about something that happened, something imagined, something that could teach us how to live." Stories are how we metabolize reality. They're how we rehearse courage before we need it, how we grieve losses safely, how we practice compassion for people and situations we haven't yet encountered. And here's what makes fantasy and science fiction uniquely powerful in this regard. When a story is set in our world, in a city we recognize, with people who look like us, our defenses go up. We compare, we judge, we think, well, that wouldn't happen to me, or I'd never do that. But put that same story on a distant planet or in a world with dragons and magic, and something remarkable happens. Our defenses lower. The allegory slips past the ego and lands somewhere deeper. This is exactly why C.S. Lewis, one of the great Christian thinkers of the 20th century, chose to write about a lion named Aslan rather than writing theology directly. He said that when he put the resurrection story into Narnia, people who had grown immune to Christianity felt it for the first time as though it were new, because it was coming at them from an unexpected angle. Tolkien called it sub-creation, the act of making a secondary world. He believed it was one of the most deeply human things we could do, because it reflected our nature as beings made in the image of a creator. To imagine is to participate in something sacred. And this is the first piece of wisdom I want to offer. The impossible is sometimes the only way to tell the truth. Reality can be so overwhelming, so close to our faces, that we can't see it clearly. We need the distance of another world to see our own with fresh eyes. Ursula K. Le Guin, perhaps the single wisest author the genre has ever produced, put it beautifully. She said that science fiction is not about the future, it's about the present. It uses the tools of imagination to illuminate what is by showing us what could be. That's not escapism. That's one of the most serious acts of moral imagination a writer can perform. Now I want to talk about something that I think is one of the deepest gifts the genre gives us. The gift of empathy for beings who are nothing like us. Think about it. One of the greatest challenges of the human condition is our tendency toward tribalism. We find it easy to feel compassion for people who look like us, think like us, come from where we come from, but extending genuine care to the truly other, the stranger, the outsider, the one who is alien to us in some way, that is one of the hardest spiritual practices there is. And fantasy and sci-fi have been quietly training us for it for decades. When you love a hobbit, a creature who is small, domestic, unheroic in every conventional sense, Tolkien is expanding your definition of what counts as worthy of respect. When you grieve the death of Spock, you're extending grief to a being who is half alien, who suppressed emotion his whole life, who was in many ways the ultimate other, and yet deeply beloved. But perhaps no story does this more perfectly than Denis Villeneuve's film Arrival. In Arrival, a linguist named Louise is tasked with communicating with extraterrestrial beings who have come to Earth, and the entire film is at its core a meditation on this question. What would it actually take to understand someone whose experience of reality is completely different from yours? Not just different language, different cognition, a different relationship to time itself. And what Louise discovers, at great personal cost, is that true understanding requires a willingness to be changed by the encounter. You cannot genuinely meet the other while remaining exactly who you were before. This is ancient wisdom. It's what every great contemplative tradition teaches about genuine compassion. Real empathy is not comfortable. It requires a kind of ego dissolution, a willingness to let the other's reality actually land in you and rearrange something. Buddhism speaks of karuna, or compassion, as something that arises naturally when we truly see the suffering of another being, not as a moral obligation, but as a spontaneous response to clear seeing. Arrival shows us that process across a galaxy of difference. Now, Avatar: The Last Airbender, which I know is technically animated, but bear with me, because it may be the most spiritually sophisticated piece of popular storytelling of the last 20 years. Avatar: The Last Airbender does something extraordinary with its villain, Prince Zuko. For 3 seasons, it shows us a young man consumed by anger, shame, and a desperate need for his father's approval. And it has enough compassion for him to show us exactly why he became that way. Not to excuse it, but to understand it. By the time Zuko completes his arc, the show has taught an entire generation of children something that most adults struggle to embody. That understanding the origins of someone's pain does not require you to accept their harmful behavior, but it does transform how you hold them in your heart. That is profound spiritual teaching, dressed in the clothes of a children's cartoon. Let's talk about power, because fantasy and science fiction are obsessed with power, and I think they're obsessed with it for exactly the right reason. The central question that runs through The Lord of the Rings, one of the most beloved stories in human history, is not, can good triumph over evil? It's something far more unsettling than that. It's, what does power do to a good person? The One Ring doesn't corrupt the wicked. Sauron doesn't need it. The ring is most dangerous to the noble, to Boromir, who genuinely wants to save his people, to Galadriel, one of the wisest beings in Middle-earth, to Gandalf himself, who refuses it precisely because he understands what it would do to him. I would use this ring from a desire to do good, but through me it would wield a power too great and terrible to imagine. This is one of the most psychologically and spiritually sophisticated observations in all of literature, that our greatest capacity for harm often comes not from our obvious flaws, but from our deepest strengths, when those strengths are fed by ego, by the hunger for control, by the certainty that we know best. Carl Jung called this the shadow, the parts of ourselves we don't acknowledge, that act through us without our awareness. Every great fantasy villain is, in some sense, a portrait of the unexamined shadow. Not just evil for evil's sake, but a reflection of something we recognize uncomfortably in ourselves. Star Wars understood this too. Anakin Skywalker doesn't fall to the dark side because he's evil. He falls because of love, because of grief, because of the desperate, all-too-human refusal to accept impermanence and loss. The Buddhists have a word for this, upadana, clinging. The attachment that arises when we love something so much that we cannot bear the thought of losing it, and so we begin to grasp and control and finally destroy the very thing we were trying to protect. Anakin's tragedy is not a space opera. It is a spiritual parable about what happens when the heart is not yet spacious enough to hold both love and loss at the same time. And Luke's redemption of his father, his refusal to stop seeing his father's humanity even when everyone else has written him off, that is not just heroism, that is the practice of metta, loving kindness, in its most radical, costly form. I want to slow down for a moment, because one of the things fantasy and science fiction do that I don't think we talk about enough is give us a way to be with death. Tolkien built mortality into the DNA of his mythology. The elves of Middle-earth are immortal, and rather than making this a blessing the story envies, Tolkien turns it into a kind of tragedy. The elves are wary. They carry too much memory. They are slowly fading, becoming more like ghosts than living beings. It is the humans, mortal, brief, burning bright and going out, who carry the real spark of life. Tolkien calls death the gift of men, not a cruel joke, but a genuine mercy. The ability to let go, to not be burdened by endless continuation. This is almost exactly the Buddhist understanding of impermanence. That is, because things pass away, that they are precious. The cherry blossom is beautiful, partly because it falls. The moment is sacred, partly because it ends. When Gandalf says, "I will not say, do not weep, for not all tears are an evil," he is not offering consolation. He is offering something rarer and more honest, the permission to grieve fully without needing the grief to be fixed or made to go away. Science fiction approaches time and mortality differently, but often with equal depth. Philip K. Dick, perhaps the most genuinely mystical writer the genre has ever produced, spent his career asking one question in 100 different ways. What is real? What is human? And does consciousness itself carry something that cannot be reduced to mechanism? His novel, Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep?, the basis for Blade Runner, asks whether an artificial being can suffer, whether empathy can arise in a mind that was manufactured. And in doing so, it quietly dismantles our certainty about where the sacred begins and ends. The famous Tears in Rain monologue, Roy Batty, the replicant, dying, reflecting on all he has seen, is not the speech of a machine. It is the speech of a being confronting impermanence with a kind of terrible beauty. All those moments will be lost in time, like tears in rain. That is not science fiction. That is poetry. That is the Psalms. That is every human being who has ever stood at the edge of their own finitude and looked back at a life that mattered. Here's where I want to bring all of this together. There's a stage in the hero's journey, Joseph Campbell's great map of the mythic story, called The Return. The hero has crossed into another world. They've faced the darkness. They've been transformed. And then they come back to the ordinary world. Not unchanged, not the same person who left, but carrying something, a gift, a wound, a wisdom that belongs not just to them, but to the community they return to. Every great fantasy and science fiction story follows this arc in some form, and I think we follow it too. Every time we genuinely enter a story, not just consume it as entertainment, but let it actually reach us, we undergo a version of that journey. We cross into another world, we encounter the other, the shadow, the beauty, the loss, and then we return to our ordinary lives. The question is, what do we bring back? I think what these stories are inviting us to bring back is this: a slightly larger heart, a slightly more generous view of who deserves our compassion, because we've practiced extending it to elves and aliens and androids and Time Lords. A slightly wiser relationship to power, because we've watched what the ring does, what the dark side costs, what happens when the shadow is denied. A slightly more peaceful relationship to impermanence, because we've grieved with hobbits and replicants and immortal elves who learned slowly to let go. A slightly braver willingness to imagine a better world, because we've seen Ursula K dream one, and Kim Stanley Robinson build one, and Gene Roddenberry point the way toward one from the bridge of the Enterprise. These are not small things. They are, I would argue, exactly the things the world needs more of right now. Not escapism, but preparation. I want to leave you with something Tolkien wrote about, what he called eucatastrophe, a word he invented. It means the sudden, unexpected turn in a story toward joy. The moment when all seems lost, and then, against all probability, something opens. He said that this moment in a great story produces a piercing, almost unbearable joy, and that this joy is a glimpse, a brief glimpse, of the deeper truth that the universe leans towards something good. Whether you hold that as a theological conviction, as a hope, or simply as a story you find worth living by, I think there is wisdom in it. The stories we love are not separate from our spiritual lives. They are a part of them. They've always been a part of them. So the next time someone tells you that fantasy is just escapism, or that science fiction is just entertainment, you might smile and remember what you know. That the most impossible stories are sometimes the truest ones, and that wisdom can arrive wearing a wizard's hat, or speaking through an alien's silence, or dying in the rain on a Los Angeles rooftop, or simply standing in a hobbit hole, wondering against all common sense whether to go on an adventure. Thank you so much for being here. If this touched something in you, I'd love to know in the comments what story, what character, what moment has carried wisdom for you. And if you'd like to keep exploring these questions together, please do subscribe and join our community. There's so much more to discover. Until next time, take care of yourself and each other.